Hey everyone, it is Ed Yatowski, and what I wanted to do was to create a video that kind of goes into more detail about the ones who walk away from Amelia's. Because one of the things that I've noticed in my past is that sometimes students have had a little bit of problems with the ones who walk away from Amelia's. Ursula Le Guin is an amazing writer. She's really, really talented. And we could establish, what makes someone a significant writer of literature is how well written their work is. But at the same time, Le Guin uses a lot of detail in the ones who walk away from Amelia. So sometimes those details can overwhelm students until they get to it, which is the suffering child. So notice on my quiz, there were a couple of questions that I asked. And the first one is that I said, imagine that where you were going to set Amelia's. Because Amelia's, in very many ways, it's sort of like a Twilight Zone episode, right? And so they tell us that Amelia's is the happiest place on earth. So given that, I kind of said, okay, if we're going to make this into a Twilight Zone episode, where would we set Amelia's, given what we know about it? So for me, sometimes I have a place of very beautiful, right? It's very idealistic, right? It's a city next to a lake or a city next to an ocean. So somehow I have this romantic view of somewhere like in Vail, Colorado. Or you could imagine setting it somewhere in like Lake Tahoe. Now they do say that Amelia's is the happiest place on earth. So sometimes I imagine maybe you set it at Disneyland or maybe in Amsterdam. And I'll come back and follow up on why I would set it there. But either which way, we know that Amelia's is the happiest place on earth. Well, what does that mean? You can do anything that your heart desires, right? You can do anything that gives you pleasure, right? Notice you can laugh, people can sing. Notice you can walk around naked at one point, right? So maybe I'd set it in Berkeley, but you can do anything that that's happy. That your heart desires, right? You can have an orgy. There's no judgment. There's no criticism. But given that, we know that there is a price to that happiness. So notice one of my quiz questions in Amelia's was, what is X and what is Y? And so, so we know that there's a price to this place of joy because. And I like my original reading of the story when I first read Amelia's. Because when I first read Amelia's, you had to go. Once in your life, you had to go. And when you got to what is spot X, you would see Y. But students have told me that my interpretation of that is wrong, right? That's optional. You know about spot X. You can go if you want to, but you don't have to go. And I like my version better where you have to go once in your life because then there are actually consequences to Amelia's. And so spot X as you go, and there are kind of a couple ways that I would take it, right? It could be the town center, it could be the basement, it could be the cellar, right? That would be spot X. And at Y, you'd see the suffering child. And notice if I were to pull out the suffering child right now and put it right here in front of the screen, right? Notice what we notice about the child. It's suffering, right? It's malnourished. It's sort of covered in a layer of black grit or grime, right? That we can't even really tell if the suffering child is a male or a female. Sometimes it cries out, sometimes it doesn't. And notice they say the entire foundation of our town is based on this suffering child, that there is nothing that we can do to help this suffering child. And if we do, society will crumble and fall apart, right? And so I always ask at the end, what happens if the one who walk away from Amelia's is some people are so outraged by the child, some people are so saddened, right, that what they end up doing is walking away. And notice that some people, if it's the first time when they see the child, it's the first time that they felt the emotion. Some people just weep and cry, some people kick the child, but in the end, some people walk away. And my question is, do those people who walk away actually make a difference, right? Does it make a difference that they walk away? And that can provide a variety of answers, because I always thought the story, wouldn't it be better if the people walked away, they went to the next town, they got Chuck Norris, they got Arnold Schwarzenegger, they got a helicopter, they came down, and they flew back into the child, and Chuck Norris jumps out of the airplane, he throws a grenade, they get the child, and they fly away, and they save the child. what I just did there was I created the next episode of The Expendables, which would be really kind of cool. But notice, even if I did that, I'd be failing society because society would still crumble. So the key, I think, to understanding Omelias is there's a couple things that we have to ask. We have to ask ourselves, what does the child symbolize? What does the child represent? Because that is the key to understanding the point of the story. And so I one time had students who said, I think, well, look, there's textual evidence that suggests that the child is a Christ-like figure, because there's textual evidence that says the child suffered for you, the child suffered for our sins. So if not the case, then the child becomes kind of a Christ-like figure. But I've had some students come up with some great ideas of what the child represented. So I one time had a summer school class where I had students say, hey, I think the child symbolizes Mexico. And I said, well, how did you come up with that idea? And so these are some kids who they were from UC San Diego, and that they had spent their first semester in San Diego, and they came back home, and they wanted to take a summer school class. And they said, look, if you look at kids who go to UC San Diego, the freshmen, right? They're 18, 19 years old. They can't really drink, but all they do is you cross the border, you go to Tijuana, you can drink, you can party, you can do anything that your heart desires, and then the next day you can just come back across the border. And if you think about it, San Diego is one of the most prosperous and wealthy cities in California, if not the nation, yet Tijuana is one of the poorest countries in Mexico, if not the world. So I think it's pretty genius that you'd say the child symbolizes Mexico. Now, the other thing that the child could also symbolize, and again, this is from students, right, is I had students say, I think the child represents Nike. When I said, well, Nike, how do you figure it symbolizes Nike? Well, they say, look, Nike is a popular shoe brand. They make a good product. But they can be kind of expensive. If we think about like the LeBron James Nikes might be $200. Some people might spend as more as like $600. But where does Nike make their product? They make their product right in Asia. Sometimes they've been accused of using child labor. They've been accused of exploitation of child labor. So it's kind of genius to suggest that the child might actually represent Nike. Right, so when you come up with what the child might symbolize or represent, it actually becomes really, really interesting. I think that's the key to understanding the story. And then notice that I think to some extent, and we can talk about this later, that maybe that the child just symbolizes the rhetoric that governments tell us about, right? Because they tell us, hey, there's nothing we can do to help the child. If we help the child, society will crumble. Well, here's the thing, right? If we look at the condition of the child, and we know that the child is living in just it's miserable, it's just covered in soot, it's suffering, right? We know that, given the condition, that maybe the child has about 1 year to live. Well, if the child has only 1 year to live, then that means within a year, the child is going to die and society is going to crumble. So, the government tells us we can't do anything to save the child, but why not? And I one time had a student, this was an interesting interpretation of the story. They imagined that they looked down deeper in the cellar, and what they saw was more children. So what that would mean is that they're just replacing the child, right? But then again, it's just rhetoric to say that there's nothing that we can do to help or save the child. And the last example that I would give, right, is because the child is covered in, say a level of grime or filth, right, that some people have argued that the child symbolizes gasoline and oil. And if you think about it, right, we're so dependent on gas and oil in our country, right? We're outraged that prices have gone up to $5, $6 a gallon. And notice most of the place where we get our gas comes from the Middle East, right? Countries that are dictatorships, countries that exploit their own citizens, countries that treat women as second-class citizens, right? But notice, if you found out, because supply is limited, right? That's why gas prices are so high. But if you found out tomorrow that gas and oil was going to all run out, what would happen to society? Well, society would quickly fall apart and crumble because so much of it is desired on gas and oil. So I just wanted to use this example to kind of talk about things that the child could symbolize and kind of represent. So what I'm going to have you guys do, there's a discussion board which you can talk about your response to Omelias. Now, I'm going to claim that along with the poems, that Amelia's is also going to be the foundation of class. So I kind of want to know what your reaction to the story was, what you think the child symbolized, and that'll give us something to play around with as we kind of analyze literature. And I'm looking forward to seeing what your ideas are, what you thought of Amelia's, and what you thought the child might represent.